This is the story so far of Arcticfurno, my first successful attempt at a beetleweight spinner. After competing with beetleweights for several years with non-spinners, I decided that I wanted to start building something more destructive. Notice how I said it was my first successful attempt. My first attempt at a spinner in this weight class was in fact Xerxes, a four-wheel drive robot with a spinning drum with discs attached on either side, or as a drisk as some would call it. Built in 2022, this robot was also my first beetleweight to be invertible in that it could drive both ways up if flipped over, albeit not very well. Pulled from the reserves to compete at Battle in the Borough 2, the disc's reach had a small 52mm diameter, but the drum weighed a hefty 330 grams. Unfortunately, the weapon was underpowered because the 20 amp speed controller I had lying around spare was just not capable of spinning it up reliably, so it's had to rely on its drive power to overcome its first opponent, Firebolt, before it then had its teeth kicked in by Sam Price's BB Shrek'd. I managed to repair the robot to take on Sam's other entry Swag Demon for round 3, however the spinner ESC had malfunctioned and thus could not spin up anymore, before eventually lost power altogether due to the battery cable breaking loose. Xerxes did qualify for a playoff to get into the round of 16, however had to withdraw as the Beck that fed power to the receiver had died and I didn't have a replacement. So, not a good performance, but considering it was my first attempt at a spinner, I knew that the only way was up, and the very next day before the tournament was even finished, I was busy sketching up ideas for a successor. This is what would become Arcticfurno. Arcticfurno, which would be based on an Arctic fox, would use a similar style of spinner that Xerxes did, but it would be lighter and have longer teeth for better reach. It would also feature a 40kg servo-powered self-righting arm, as I didn't like how poorly Xerxes drove upside down, and of course the spinning weapon is a lot more effective when you're the right way up. I did have to sacrifice the two front drive motors to make the weight, but I would still have four-wheel drive by using timing belts connecting to the front wheels. As for the artwork, I based the style of that on the fox's appearance from the video game Endling Extinction is Forever. The 62mm diameter discs were designed by Morgan from Team Forgotten Gods, and the spinner weighed in at 260 grams with a 35 amp ESC powering it, so it would be better suited for the job at hand. Arcticfurno was completed in March 2023 and would debut at Scout Showdown 2 that same month. We won our first fight against Voltaic by knockout, landing a good bite on him, but we lost the fight against Vertex by judge's decision after having problems with the drive that caused it to lock up on one side. This was the first time I'd entered a robot using drive belts to make four-wheel drive, so naturally there was going to be teething issues in that department. I dominated the third fight against Oobly up until he hit me in such a way that my front forks folded over and beached my drive off the ground, immobilizing me. This cost me a place in a knockout bracket, but I was pleased with the robot's performance as a whole and knew that there was definitely potential in that design, but it was going to need some refinements for Robot Rebellion that summer. The first thing I did for Arcticfurno Mark II was make the front of the chassis more durable, because it turned out that HDPE wasn't as resilient to high impacts as I thought it might have been where mounting the front wedge was concerned. We changed the design of the disc at the front so that the diameter increased from 62mm to 70, and also modelled the shape of it after that of Hypershock from BattleBots, which I thought suited Arcticfurno's aesthetic more. I also modified the mounting of the forks at the front so I would not get beached on them again like I did before. Arcticfurno took part in Heat L at Robot Rebellion 2023, where problems with the drive cost me a judge's decision against Bon, where the self-righting arm came in clutch at defeating Kryptonesia in the second fight, before I lost to seeded robot Night Fury after getting my front blade embedded in the wall. Arcticfurno would then convincingly win the tiebreaker to finish second in the heat, which meant that we would go into the play-in rumble for the round of 16. After Deja 2 immobilized itself, Schism would send Arcticfurno down the pit to win the fight. I was out in the main event, but would team up with Deja 2 to compete in the tag team tournament successfully, where we reached the finals after a shock win over Stratus and New York Slice to lose to a very well organised Oobly and Mini Spinny. Henry Strang, who drove Bon, suggested I should try and make the self-righting arm into a proper lifter, as I was seasoned with control bots. I liked this idea, so I sought to take it further. After competing in the Robotic Soccer Tournament at RoboNerd 2023, I made a few minor tweaks to the robot for Battle in the Borough 3 that November. This included sacrificial side armour plating on top of the side panels and some longer front forks, but the most obvious change was that the self-righting arm was redesigned to have optional lifter attachments at the front. Although it was intended to have one fork on either side, in the end I was only able to fit one due to the weight limit. This lifter attachment would come in handy in my first fight at Borough 3, effortlessly hoisting Cormoran. However, it was too large to lift over, and the arm was also prone to getting jammed inside their chassis. After winning my second fight against Revolution, a dodgy speed controller cost me my fight against Fisher Slice when it locked one side into forward drive and it sent me into the pit. 2 wins out of 3 was enough to get me into the round of 16, where I would promptly be decimated by Baby Deadbod. He had struck the side panel so hard that it pulled at the front wheel axle that was mounted to it, and thus the drive belt pulled the axle to the motor at the back out of shape. That is some insane power. A respectable performance at this event overall, but I knew that we could do better. Arcticfurno would not compete again for just over a year when Battle in the Borough 4 rolled around in December 2024. Mostly rebuilt from the ground up, Arcticfurno Mark III now ran on brushless Repeat Max Mark II motors for drive, as the older 22mm motors lacked the torque that I wanted. I also moved the drive motors to the front to keep the motor cans out of the way of the internals. The disc spinner was thinner but had a larger 80mm diameter, and the self-righter was now a fully fledged forklift-style lifter powered by a 70kg servo, using a belt and pulley system. On paper this was the best the robot had ever been, however in practice it was not to be. When the event came round, our first opponent was Procrastination, and although we survived our encounter with them and got the points, the nylon 3D printing for the lifter snapped. It had never occurred to me that nylon could be brittle, and because I didn't have any spares, I had to bodge it back together with HDPE. It would be effective as a lifter, but it no longer had the range to self-right, which would come back to get me later on. The drive on the left-hand side also became prone to locking up, and this was something that I was never able to figure out as to why it did so. The second fight was against Horizontal Spinner Just a Wee Slice, which didn't last long, as after a couple of hits it caused the drive to lock up again, and I knew that it would be best to forfeit the match for the sake of self-preservation. So in round 3 I fought against Nezumi, and unfortunately another problem occurred with the spinner this time. The idea had been to have proper tooth timing belts on the spinner, but unfortunately the setup was prone to cogging, so I reverted back to the O-rings, which were more tried and tested. Unfortunately the teeth on the pulleys were prone to stripping the belts. However, the lifter came in effective, and the judges awarded me the win, which was enough to get me into the round of 16 for a second successive tournament. My opponent was 3 robots in a trench coat who had opted to go with their beta bar setup. Had Arcticfurno been working as intended, I may have had a better shot at winning the fight, but because the belts on the spinner stripped again, and because I couldn't self-right, this was where my run ended. I would also take part in the tag team competition afterwards with Ultros, where we would reach the semi-finals. Arcticfurno has consistently achieved middling performances throughout his career, which felt quite frustrating because I always felt that the robot had more to give, but unforeseen gremlins always got in the way of a potentially deep run. After acquiring a 3D printer, I printed the prototype chassis for a possible Arcticfurno Mark IV. However, at this point the complexity of the build and my desire to move on to other projects has left this project shelved for the time being. This is not to say that the Menace of the North Wind won't return at some stage in the future, and it's good to know that he'll be there waiting for me in case I decide to bring him back for another go at it.